IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
You're listening to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Pareek. Before we begin, I'd like to recommend Takshashila's graduate certificate in public policy programs. If the topic of today's discussion interests you, consider signing up for our Defense and Foreign Affairs course. We also offer courses in tech policy and health and life sciences. To know more, visit the link in the show notes. Between the 10th and 11th of March, news broke that a projectile was fired into Pakistan and originated from India. Subsequent series of disclosures and acknowledgements, both from the Pakistani and Indian sides, are certain that it was indeed a missile, not a drone, not an experimental test vehicle, but a missile accidentally fired during a training exercise. The implications of this mistake could have been dire, as India and Pakistan are both nuclear-armed states. To discuss, I have with me today our old friend Pranav Satyanath, who is an independent analyst and someone who studies news. Welcome, Pranav.
Thank you very much, Aditya.
So to start with, Pranav, let's start with the specifics. What's the known, what's the speculated, and what's somewhere in between about the incident itself?
It's a very strange incident to speak of, firstly, because especially among nuclear armed states, launching a missile because of an accident into an enemy territory is something that we have heard for the first time. This is not an false alarm. This is an actual missile landing inside enemy territory. So with that being said, this is very strange. But with that being said, let's sort of understand what really happened. On March 9th, the Pakistani Air Force said that a projectile had entered the Pakistani territory from the Indian side. And they said that this was traveling at supersonic speeds. They said that this object was tracked and it entered Pakistani territory without making any specific claims about what kind of a projectile this was. 2 days later, on March 11th, the Indian Air Force published a short statement in which it said that a missile had accidentally landed in Pakistani territory in a village called Mia Chanu in the Khanwal province in Punjab. And the Air Force said that the incident was deeply regrettable. They said this happened because of a technical malfunction, and they said the incident was being investigated. And because of the scale of the problem, because of its Indian, because the issue is so sensitive, later we found out that this was actually a BrahMos missile. The Pakistanis later said this was a BrahMos missile which traveled almost 250 kilometers into Pakistani territory within about 2.5 to 3 minutes. Then this is exactly what happened. The Indian Air Force said that, the MOD said that the missile was unarmed and it did not cause any injuries to anyone. But yes, it very strangely, a technical malfunction during routine maintenance and inspections caused the missile to accidentally fire and veer off course and go into Pakistani territory. That's what happened. We don't know what caused the glitch. We don't know to what extent the Pakistanis were able to track this missile, and we can go into those details further. And we don't know how much we don't know how much fuel was actually in the missile. It has traveled almost 250 kilometers, so we are assuming that the missile was in its full capacity.
Mm-hmm.
The BrahMos missile is a cruise missile, right? So it's an air-breathing engine. The initial first stage is a solid rocket motor to simply take it off ground and off the launch tube. For the rest of its flight, it actually uses an air-breathing ramjet engine. So it is in fact a liquid fuel engine rather than solid fuel, which is what gives the cruise missile the capability to maneuver, unlike solid rocket motors, unlike solid rockets, which have very limited ability to change the direction.
Interesting. Okay, moving on. So what is the implication of an exercise like this going wrong in terms of launch on warning miscalculations and mutually assured destruction, where a projectile is launched but strays into adversary territory?
First, we have to understand the context in which this is taking place. This happened when there is certainly tension in the international space, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But between India and Pakistan, we are not under a situation of any form of crisis or a border incident, right? India and Pakistan are having a perfectly peaceful time at the moment. Nothing whatsoever has happened. So, because this incident has taken place during peacetime, it is perfectly makes sense for both sides to think calmly and rationally about what happened. And there is no launch on warning because India has continually said that it has a no first use policy. The BrahMos missile is, in fact, a conventional missile and cannot be armed with, or India says that it will not arm the BrahMos with nuclear warheads. So, in all likeliness, the Pakistanis would have either wondered whether if this is a conventional strike against, let's say, a terrorist operations camp, or given the way with which the direction in which it traveled, they might have assumed that this was some form of a mistake on the Indian side. So during peacetime, during perfectly peaceful, normal time, this should not cause an incident. This should not cause any sort of a warlike incident or a crisis where Pakistan also tries to strike back. And I do not find any serious implications during peacetime. But if there were to be a border incident, if there were to be border clashes, or if there were to be a situation where India, a few weeks earlier, had conducted some form of operations within Pakistan, secret ones, then there is a perfect reason to assume that this would have worried the Pakistanis a lot, particularly that India might be striking one of their own, one of Pakistan's bases. And Pakistan would have at least responded in kind, or they would have shown they would have shown less restraint in what they could also demonstrate. But at this time, the implications are that during peacetime, both sides acted in ways that are perfectly the way that we expect nuclear powers to behave. It's also there are a lot of things to feel bad about this incident because the other side was not notified about the test very quickly. The missile was not supposed to be launched at all. India and Pakistan do have missile launch bilateral notification agreement. But only for ballistic missiles. They weren't. This was a cruise missile that was being tested, and there was no absolutely no warning given. These are regrettable, and this is a chance for both India and Pakistan to think about how they can improve safety and how they can talk about risk reduction.
Agreed. And I think it's probably, as you said, a unique incident that has no precedent. So we don't really know exactly how the situation would be handled if a similar incident happened again between two other powers.
Yes, actually, because when we talk about such incidents, I would just like to remind in 1995, Norway and the United States were conducting a test of a sounding rocket in 1995, January 1995. The rocket was called the Black Brant, and it was a four-stage sounding rocket, and its testing characteristics was such in it was carried out in such a way that for the Russians, it seemed like they were testing a Trident ballistic missile. And for a very brief period, it really did trigger the early warning systems of the Russian side. So in some cases, so when you have a large number of tracking systems and a large number of sensors, you can have the problem of distinguishability. And it wouldn't be very clear about whether or not one side has tested a ballistic missile or is launching a ballistic missile or a simple sounding rocket. So on the Indian and Pakistani side, we do not have so many number of sensors and satellites to track all these objects. So in a way, having less capability might have also saved both countries.
On that note, folks, we'll take a small break. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talks to legendary singer Usha Utthap and writer Shrishti Jha, who authored her biography. The conversation ranges across a wide variety of topics, from becoming a music icon to favorite musical partners in the Indian musical industry, and a whole lot more. On Press Decode, the host takes stock of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav tells us a story that connects coconuts, the Cold War, and nuclear fusion. And finally, do join Kavita and myself as we celebrate 7 years of IVM Podcast on the 900th episode of Cyrus Says. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you enjoyed this show or any of our shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth really does help us. And also, please, a rating if you could. That is also extremely helpful to us. And remember, we're also on YouTube. You can check out ivmpodcast.com/YouTube to get a list of the different channels that we operate on YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, India Water Portal, and Max Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back, folks. You're listening to All Things Policy, and we're discussing the accidental missile launch into Pakistan. So, moving on, Pranav, can the Pakistani radars and other ISR assets distinguish a missile without a warhead from a fully armed, intentionally launched missile? Is there a concept of warning shots, so to say, in sophisticated rockets?
The simple answer would be no. Trying to distinguish between a missile, trying to distinguish a missile with a warhead and without a warhead is nearly impossible. Mostly because, first of all, the warhead package is very small. It might be up to 150 kilograms because that's the explosive package. And second, your missile is traveling like a BrahMos. It's traveling at speeds of nearly Mach 2.5 to Mach 3, that your radars have very little time to sort of make those calculations. And the best they could do is track the missile path, so to say. That's the most thing they could do. Pakistan has very limited capabilities. It does not have any space-based sensors. Their air defense, they do not have a ballistic missile defense either. Their air defense system is relatively simple. They operate the HQ-9 air defense system, and they operate a medium-range air defense system called HQ-16 surface-to-air missile system given by China. Both of these systems are sophisticated in the sense that they allow for air defense tracking, they allow for aircraft tracking, they allow for drone tracking. But when it comes to a supersonic BrahMos missile, then this capability has some limited utility, because the main purpose of a cruise missile is to avoid being tracked by radars, is to avoid missile defenses or any form of air defenses through maneuvers. So it's also very difficult to handle or to track the cruise missiles, because they are supposed to be low visibility force multipliers, so to say.
Interesting. So, that answers something that I had in my mind for a while now. So, yep.
Yeah, the warhead distinguishability is quite an interesting concept. Even the most sophisticated radar systems in the United States would have difficulty distinguishing between a missile that has a warhead or does not have a warhead, or even distinguish between warheads and balloons. The way ballistic missile countermeasures work in such a way that they take advantage of this weakness of radar systems, that you can deploy all sorts of decoys and can confuse the early warning, tracking, and radar systems.
So let's talk a little more, related to the news cycle. So how does the scenario elsewhere gets affected from this incident, since the hostilities are still ongoing between Russia and Ukraine, and there have been some nuclear signaling from Russia? What implications could this mishap have had in a worst case scenario for the world?
The worst case scenario for the world in the Ukraine Russia crisis would be a Russian caliber missile, for example, veering off course and entering Romania, for example. That would be genuinely very, very worrying, right? But it is also a crisis situation. So we would expect that NATO and Russia would have some form of communication channel to resolve this issue. But humans do not work rationally, especially during crises, especially when you have so many projectiles being launched and fired upon cities in Ukraine and military bases in Ukraine, and launching on various surfaces that host man-portable air defenses. It's very difficult to think about a scenario where uh, NATO would think rationally in case the conflict is going astray. And we do not have to expect that things will escalate to nuclear levels, because in the past we've seen incidents like these happen. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was missiles being tested in the Vandenberg Air Force Base. There was an aircraft. There was a U-2 spy plane that was shot down. There were aircraft that were veering off course and going into Soviet territory. Even in such incidents, some good luck and some rational thinking helped. So I would assume that India and Pakistan's incident will register in the minds of the higher commands in NATO, and they themselves will understand the context in which this could happen in a Russia-NATO scenario, and they would mentally issue more restraint. And one of the lessons is, how can countries issue restraint when even the most unexpected things can happen? That's one lesson they could take away. And then one lesson that everyone should take away from this is that accidental launches can happen in ways that you wouldn't expect at all. And countries would at times, even in the context of a crisis going on next to NATO's borders, they would have to think of ways in which to mitigate these risks by having the right channels of communication, by talking to Russian representatives in NATO countries. These are some of the measures they could take, and issuing notifications of when an accident has happened. India took 2 days to properly respond about the incident, whereas India was heavily criticized by the Pakistani side for doing so. And Moeed Yusuf, who's the national security advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, also was in the early on. He was in a personal capacity. He was wondering if this was done out of intention or pure accident. So improving communication is important, and the earlier you notify of the accident on your side, you are reducing harm on yourself, because the enemy can see this as a hostile measure and they can retaliate. They would retaliate, which would be only bad for you. So disclosure, transparency is something that the Indian side should be more comfortable with, and this is a lesson that Russia and NATO can take away. Yeah, that's one of my longer answers to your short question.
So there was also an incident recently around the same time frame, I think, the very day that Tu-141, Tupolev 141 Strich, a recon drone belonging to Ukraine, strayed into Croatian territory. So I think the Croatians were also pretty miffed at NATO for responding very slowly to that development. And there have been speculation that Ukraine may have intentionally done that to get their no-fly zone requirement that they've been putting up in front of the Western countries, that please enforce a no-fly zone over our airspace. So I think something very similar happened exactly on the same day. That it's quite a coincidence, but thankfully we're still here, and hopefully we would be tomorrow as well.
Yeah, but we've also seen the scenario go in the worst way possible, right? If we remember the incident between Russia and Turkey, a Russian Sukhoi Su-24 was shot down by a Turkish F-16 fighter. This was a NATO country, Turkey, using an aircraft to shoot down a Russian Sukhoi, which they claimed had veered off course, right? So these incidents can happen. This is launching a cruise missile is one of very strange ones, but we've seen happen even with aircraft, and we've seen Russian aircraft that have veered. We have seen the South Korean aircraft that had veered off course, and the Soviets shot it down. We have seen these incidents in the past. These are not new. It's just the Indian-Pakistani case offers a new dimension to a range of accidental incidents that have happened in the course of several decades between nuclear powers.
Yeah, on that note, folks, we'll call it a wrap. If you like today's discussion, please check out all past and future episodes of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.
इन्फ्लेशन, फिस्कल डेफिसिट, जीडीपी, एमएसपी, एनपीए, इक्विटी मार्केट वगैरह वगैरह। दोस्तों, हमने सारे शब्द टीवी या अखबार में जरूर देखे होंगे या फिर सुने होंगे, पर हम में से कितने लोग हैं जो ये जानते हैं कि इन सब का सीधा प्रभाव पड़ता है हमारी सैलरी पर, हमारे इंक्रीमेंट पर और कमबख्त हमारे खर्चों पर। दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है अभिनव त्रिवेदी और मैं बात कर रहा हूँ इक्का दुक्का इकोनॉमी पॉडकास्ट से, जहाँ पे इस तरह के इकोनॉमिक और फाइनेंशियल टर्म्स को मैं जोड़ूंगा सीधा आपकी जेब से। हर मंगलवार एक नया एपिसोड सुने IVM पॉडकास्ट की वेबसाइट, ऐप या फिर किसी भी अन्य पॉडकास्ट प्लेटफॉर्म पर।